So, today I want to continue talking about how conservatives have planned to overturn Roe v. Wade since the court gave its ruling in 1973. In the last video, I talked about the history of abortion in the United States and the tactics of anti abortion activists. Today, I'd like to talk about two other tactics that have been used by conservatives in order to help overturn Roe v. Wade. These two tactics are to attempt to take over state legislatures and to attempt to take over the courts, specifically the Supreme Court. These two remaining tactics that I'd like to talk about were not designed exclusively for the anti abortion movement at first. Rather, they were part of a broader conservative strategy designed in order to put the Republican Party back into power. That said, anti abortion sentiment was prevalent in many who designed these strategies, and as the anti abortion movement began to be recognized as the base of the Republican Party with evangelical Christians, these tactics began to further support the anti abortion movement and to spread their message. So let's start today by talking about how the Republicans took over local and state legislatures. Now, it's worth noting that before the 1970s, local politics generally belonged to the Democrats. We can see that with the infographic I just put on screen, where we see that throughout the 1960s and 70s, Democrats largely controlled most state governments, and that included both the legislature and the governor's office. Throughout the 80s, while the Republicans still have a bit of a decline, we kind of see the Democrats pushed back slowly until we enter into about the 1990s, where Republicans start to take over and really don't let go all the way through 2011, where they had 24 states in control. And that's more or less maintained, give or take a state, since then. And so this has been the shift that we've seen where the Democrats were once in control of so many state legislatures, but now it's the Republicans. And a big part of that whole strategy had to do with the Republican organizations mimicking the tactics of the Democrats up to that point. See, the National Education Association, a union, worked to maintain the local base for the Democratic Party and functioned kind of as the arm of liberal thought by drafting policies that would be used in different local and state legislatures in order to further the goals of local communities and activists. This essentially held the Democratic Party accountable in a way that it's really not today. Meanwhile, during this same era, Republicans, and this era being, of course, the 70s, Republicans and their corporate donors generally fought for a national strategy to implement policy from above. However, a group of Republicans in 1973 got together with the express purpose of changing this. And that's when the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, was formed. It's worth noting that two of the founding members of ALEC were Henry Hyde and Paul Weyrich, both of whom had strong anti abortion positions, and generally the products that they've put out over the years have shown that position. Henry Hyde would draft the Hyde Amendment, which prevented federal money from being spent to support abortion, in 1976, and Paul Weyrich, founder of the Heritage Foundation, is an evangelical Christian activist who would rally his base to become the core of the Republican Party. Now, ALEC was designed specifically as a reaction to the success of unions like the National Education Association. Their goal was to copy the tactics of unions and create policies and draft bills that could be implemented in local and state legislatures that backed conservative ideals. Now, at first, the organization relied on heavy amounts of funding from private donations and grants, which enabled the organization to focus on moral panic issues, not unlike the ones that we see in today's Republican Party. They fought hard against things like the Equal Rights Amendment, gun control, gay rights, unions, and of course, abortion rights, all the while attempting to recruit legislators into its fold as it continued to expand. Now, by the 1980s, ALEC would actually gain a lot of influence and power because of the Reagan administration and by establishing connections with corporations through the power that the Reagan administration gave them. The Reagan administration used its influence and power to allow for cross state influence through the organization, which allowed ALEC politicians and policies to flow across the country more easily. Essentially, they created a pipeline in which bills could be passed from state to state and legislator to legislator without having to be drafted every single time in every single state. Further, the Reagan administration's attacks on unions eliminated Alex's biggest threat by essentially eliminating their opposition in local and state politics and giving them a monopoly on the union developed tactics that they stole. On the other side of things, since these conservative interests aligned with a lot of large corporations, given both the mutual anti union position and the general class interest that they shared, Alex started receiving large amounts of funding in exchange for pro corporate policies, which would then be implemented on the state level. This funding created an imbalance that embodies the modern system of politics, where it's pay to play. And corporate funding allows conservative politicians to attempt to overwhelm any grassroots organization that might try to stand up to them, as well as essentially take over state legislatures. So, over the next 30 years, ALEC, in conjunction with other right wing organizations such as State Policy Network and Americans for Prosperity, would strike at unions, medical care, gun control, corporate taxes, food stamps, unemployment, and so much more. The organization holds meetings where it will develop laws and hands them now over to state legislators. The policies that they've created include laws on immigration, voter ID laws, stand your ground policies, anti LGBT legislations, and of course, laws attacking reproductive rights. Now, all of this has been done through tactics that are legally not lobbying, but effectively function as a form of lobbying, while the organization claims to have close to 2,000 state legislators in their organization, some of whom are confirmed to have paid their dues with their own state's funding. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about ALEC, there is a website, alecexposed.org, and I do want to highlight this website because they have compounded so much information that talks about everything that goes into ALEC, who's behind it, what their essential resources are, what are their hot topics, and it even goes over some of these model bills that they are talking about, as well as providing specific state reports for what ALEC does there, and keeps a record of all the news tied to them as well. It does a really great job. And it really does highlight how ALEC functions and how it was able to essentially complete this goal that we saw before, where Republicans are now in charge of all of these state legislatures. They've really amounted a lot of power and have actually been successful in taking over and doing what they set out to accomplish. So finally, that puts us at the fourth tactic, which is the conservative goal of taking over the courts and, most importantly, taking over the Supreme Court. Now, this tactic's roots are found in Yale Law School and University of Chicago Law, where a club by the name of the Federalist Society, which was meant purposefully to be an ironic name, was created in 1982. This club of 200 members wanted to assert conservative values into the courts in order to counter what it saw as liberal courts dominating the country. Their express goal was a originalist interpretation of the Constitution, which ultimately meant that they wanted to see any progressive decisions, including those to protect oppressed groups, overturned. Even at their first symposium, Robert Bork gave a speech in which he specifically discussed overturning aspects of the New Deal and targeting Roe v. Wade. We have here an article from Politico where we see Bork's speech mentioned, and it says Bork, for example, who had been a law professor at Yale and had just become a federal judge, spoke of the onslaught of the New Deal and the gentrification of the Constitution. Abortion and, quote, acceptable sexual behavior, he said, should be, quote, reserved to the states, Pointedly, with Roe v. Wade, he said, the Supreme Court had nationalized an issue which is a classical case for local control. There is simply no national moral consensus about abortion, and there is not about to be. So, yeah, these words that he said at this particular meeting would be used against him later in order to actually deny him a seat on the Supreme Court. However, another person who was there, Judge Scalia, who has been promoted to the Supreme Court, was actually at that same event. And while it was found out that Bork was denied for this specific reason, people like him and Scalia have gotten on the court since, and their ideas continue to flourish. So yeah, even though he didn't get on the court, his ideas have continued to remain a part of this strategy and have moved forward as conservatives have taken over courts. So as it tends to happen with conservative organizations like this one, members of this group had little issue getting funding from wealthy conservative donors, and many found themselves working in Washington, D.C., during the Reagan and Bush administrations. So you kind of had ALEC kind of going on at the same time that this was happening, and it's kind of the Reagan and Bush administrations that end up being the conduit for a lot of this to start taking these seeds to start growing and forming roots to take power by the time we reach the early 2000s. Now, at the same time, the organization began to expand and feature more chapters at more universities, ever expanding its message and influencing an entire generation of new potential judges. By 1992, the organization had brought forward its first attempt to overthrow Roe v. Wade with the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case. Despite 5 of the judges being appointed by Republicans at the time, the Casey decision maintained Roe v. Wade, but it actually damaged abortion rights significantly by making room for certain state abortion restrictions, as well as passing the proof of undue burden from the state to the pregnant individual. This kind of renewed the Federalist Society's fervor, though, because despite the fact that you had all these Republican justices on the court, they really didn't get the outcome they were looking for. And it was seen that the justices that were appointed by both Reagan and Bush were seen as too liberal. Just let that sink in for a moment. The justices produced by Reagan and Bush were seen as too liberal, and therefore they had to fight harder over the next 2 decades. And fight harder they did, because over the next 2 decades, Federalist Society strived to fit as many judges into seats as possible, with judges favorable to their causes. Perhaps the most influential man that's come out of this whole movement for the Federalist Society has been a man by the name of Leo, who was recently vice president of the Federalist Society and is currently co-chairman of the board of directors there. Leo founded a chapter of the organization at Cornell University in 1989 and got a job through them not long after. During his early time in Washington, D.C., he actually became close friends with Justice Clarence Thomas, who continues to sit on the bench today and is likely to vote alongside Justice Alito. Now later, Leo worked with the second Bush administration in the appointment of federal judges, which led to over half of George Bush's total appointments being Federalist Society members, in addition to 2 Supreme Court justices with John Roberts and Samuel Alito, who of course put out the draft. And if you want to understand just the vile nature of Leo and what he stands for and how he presents himself, I kind of want to show off something that the Washington Post had put about him, that in January of 2003, Leo actually called White House officials, including Kavanaugh, to object to a plan by Bush to weigh in on affirmative action. Bush was going to criticize the practice, but praise racial diversity. Leo complained that praising diversity would, quote, disgust any conservative who thinks that this is a matter of principle, according to a previously unreported email by a White House official describing one of the calls. So yeah, this is the type of person that Leo is and what he essentially stands for. This is the type of conservative principles that he's talking about, and he kind of said the quiet part out loud. Now, in addition to this, it's also worth noting that Leo's been accused over the years of having a network of dark money groups that have been funneling millions of dollars towards the appointment of judges. And we actually have an article from law.com talking about this. Because as the years would go by, Leo would also be instrumental in helping the Donald Trump administration. And on law.com, it says that he sits at the center of an almost $250 million network of dark money groups working to fill our courts with men and women, but mostly men, who will roll back the clock on our laws and democracy all the way back to the robber baron era. The movement, which Leo now has termed the resurrection of the structural constitution, has a long history and deep roots. But you can really see it emerging in the Reagan years. Following the rejection of the ultra-conservative Robert Bork's nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court, you can see it in the confirmation hearings of Justice Clarence Thomas, when then Senator Joe Biden, chairman of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, said Thomas was unfit for a lifetime seat on the Supreme Court because he embraced this extreme agenda. And we get further information about this when we see that citizensforethics.org has posted about how the Rule of Law Trust, an organization that he has ties to, actually has $80 million. And the way this group kind of functions and why it's particularly interesting is that despite the fact that it has $80 million, the group seems remarkably hollow. It claimed it had no employees and no volunteers in its first year, and listed what appears to be a virtual office in Virginia as its main address. And so this is really the kind of thing that we're talking about when we're saying that there's a, quote, growing constellation of dark money groups tied to Federalist Society co-chairman Leonard Leo. And this provides new details kind of at the role that he had in said firm. And so this is what we're seeing from him. And, it's not surprising that these large wealthy donors giving money through these different charity groups that Leo just happens to be a part of, and that everything is kind of connected in this way through money. And so they funnel all this money into the campaigns of judges and the ads supporting the nominations of Federalist Society Supreme Court justices and even some other justices that they are appointing to lower courts. And this is how it's kind of worked. Now, as I mentioned, Leo would go on to work with the Trump administration and would become the person responsible for appointing the majority of the justices under the Trump administration. And naturally, most of them came from the Federalist Society. He actually handpicked all of the Supreme Court nominees, screening them to make sure that they would not be as liberal as those that allowed Roe to survive last time. This means that Leo and the Federalist Society have 5 judges on the bench, plus Leo's good friend Clarence Thomas. Now, if you want to understand just how close of friends they are, it's worth noting that in the same Washington Post article, it was determined that in 2010, Leo served on the board of a Tea Party group called Liberal Central. Ginny Thomas, wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, received $120,000 as the startup's president that year. She later stepped down following questioning about possible conflicts of interest, saying the issue had become a distraction for the group. But this is the connection between Leo and Clarence Thomas and Ginny Thomas, and as you are aware, there's been a lot of information about how Ginny Thomas was also tied to the January 6th insurrections. And so you kind of see how all of this money is flowing around and how the conservatives have largely used these tactics and used all of this funding from these large conservative groups in order to secure these archaic positions and rights and center them into the law and cement them into the law. So this brings us to our present reality, where the Federalist Society has influenced an entire generation of judges, has stacked the courts during the 4 Republican presidencies since its inception and has effectively taken over the Supreme Court at this point. This organization has been after Roe v. Wade since the start, with the speech that we heard from Bork. And Justice Alito's draft is just the final nail waiting to be hammered in that the conservatives have been waiting for almost 50 years. In short, all of this has been purposefully designed throughout these tactics and with all of the donations that have supported them. These 4 tactics have been effective at getting us to where we are. The propaganda tactics have sought to see anti-abortion activists as the social protectors of both pregnant individuals and the fetuses they've falsely identified as alive. In addition to this, they have introduced shame and guilt into a conversation that should be about bodily autonomy and the needs of the pregnant individual. All the while, they've harassed and terrorized medical professionals and their patients. And at the same time, the combination of control of the Supreme Court and state legislatures has effectively put Republicans in a place where they have made the federal government useless for producing anything even remotely liberal, let alone leftist. Anything that's legislated federally can easily be overturned by the courts and thrown back to the states. And prior court decisions such as Roe v. Wade do not fare any better in these instances. Precedent is being thrown out the window in favor of this idea of originalist constitutional thought. Many of those states are, of course, now in the hands of Republicans, who are ready to pass more and more legislation denying people rights and freedoms, and ultimately just answering to whatever ALEC tells them to put on the books. Naturally, all of this was done using funding from some of the wealthiest donors and corporations in the United States in order to protect their class interest. Their capital allowed them to overturn the work of unions, activists, feminists, and so many more groups who have had progressive ideas and understandings. I think it was apparent that the suffering that will follow, and it should be apparent that the suffering that will follow, was deliberately and purposefully designed by these groups. This is where we find ourselves today, in a place where a bunch of people are about to have their rights taken away from them by the state, with one party pushing harder than ever, and the other seemingly doing nothing. So with that said, I hope you'll join me next time where I address the question of why the Democrats can't protect Roe v. Wade. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you watched today, do consider liking the video, subscribing, leaving a comment, and joining my Discord. And if you are in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything I mentioned are in the description down below. Feel free to check them out. That said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.